A quiet flight took a shocking turn when a flight attendant accused a passenger of theft. Just minutes later, the truth unraveled, and the flight attendant faced consequences no one saw coming. What really happened on board? Before we start the story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. The cabin buzzed with the usual sounds of pre-flight chaos. Passengers shuffled down the narrow aisles, some struggling to find space in the overhead bins while others settled into their seats. Among the crowd was Janelle Carter, a composed woman in her early 30s. Her sharp blazer and neatly braided hair gave her a confident presence. She adjusted her carry-on bag and placed it carefully in the overhead compartment above her first-class seat. With a polite nod to the attendant nearby, she sat down, pulling a tablet from her bag and scrolling through her notes for an upcoming presentation. Janelle didn't notice the curious glances from other passengers. She rarely cared about what people thought of her, focusing instead on the important work ahead. The calm atmosphere around her didn't last long. As she tapped on her screen, her focus was interrupted by a flight attendant, Linda Harmon, who stood a few rows away, her sharp eyes scanning the cabin like a hawk. Linda had been with the airline for years. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, her hair tightly tied back, and her voice often carried a commanding tone. She approached Janelle's seat briskly, stopping just short of her row. Without a greeting, Linda spoke firmly. "Excuse me, ma'am, can I see your boarding pass?" Janelle looked up, confused by the sudden request, but handed over the pass with a small smile. Linda studied it, her eyes narrowing slightly. "This is for first class?" she asked, her tone sharp. Janelle nodded calmly. "Yes, it is," she replied. Linda gave the pass a final glance before handing it back, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't move, hovering for a moment as though waiting for Janelle to explain something that didn't need explaining. As Linda walked away, Janelle felt the tension settle in her chest, but quickly pushed it aside. She had dealt with situations like this before, people doubting her credentials, her place in spaces like this. She reminded herself not to let it bother her. Instead, she turned back to her screen, hoping the incident was over. It wasn't. A few minutes later, Linda returned, but this time with an expression that made it clear she wasn't here to check a ticket. She glanced at the overhead bin, then back at Janelle. "Ma'am," Linda began, her voice louder than necessary, "we've had a report that a passenger's bag has gone missing. I need to inspect your carry-on." Janelle froze for a moment, caught off guard. She blinked at Linda, confused but polite. "My carry-on? It's been there since I boarded," she said, gesturing toward the bin. Linda crossed her arms, her expression stern. "It matches the description of the missing bag," she said, her voice cold. "I need to see inside." Passengers nearby began turning their heads, their conversations halting as whispers spread through the cabin. Janelle glanced around, her calm exterior cracking just slightly under the weight of so many eyes. She swallowed her frustration and stood, reaching for her bag. As she handed it to Linda, her voice was steady but firm. "This is my property. I packed it myself. You won't find anything missing." Linda's frown deepened as she unzipped the bag, rummaging through it with little care for its contents. Janelle could feel the sting of humiliation building, but she remained quiet, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. After a few moments, Linda paused, lifting a small leather wallet from the bag. It wasn't Janelle's. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Janelle's stomach sank as Linda held the wallet up for the cabin to see. "This isn't yours, is it?" she asked with an edge in her voice. Janelle stared at the wallet, completely baffled. "No," she said quietly. Her voice grew stronger. "It's not mine. I've never seen it before." But Linda wasn't listening. She turned to a younger flight attendant standing nearby. "Call security," she said curtly, still clutching the wallet. The younger attendant hesitated, glancing nervously at Janelle, then at Linda. "I think we should check the—" "Do it now," Linda snapped, cutting her off. The younger woman flinched and hurried toward the front of the plane. Janelle stood frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The passengers around her watched, some leaning closer to get a better look. She could feel the burn of their stares, the judgment, the disbelief. Her calm was slipping, but she knew she had to stay collected. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, dialing a number quickly. When the call connected, her voice was low but steady. "It's Janelle. I need you to get in touch with the airline's legal team, now." She ended the call and turned her gaze back to Linda, her expression unreadable. Something was building in the air, something Linda hadn't anticipated. The cabin fell silent as Linda continued holding the wallet, her grip firm and her posture unwavering. She looked back at Janelle, her expression a mix of suspicion and authority. The younger flight attendant, Emily, returned from the front of the plane, whispering something to Linda. Whatever Emily said didn't seem to deter her. Linda nodded curtly and handed her the wallet before turning her attention back to Janelle. "I'm going to need you to come with me to the galley while we sort this out," Linda said, her tone devoid of any flexibility. Passengers exchanged glances, some whispering while others outright stared. Janelle took a deep breath, her frustration now evident in the sharpness of her movements. "Fine," she said, grabbing her phone and her bag. She followed Linda toward the rear of the plane, her steps steady but deliberate. The tension in the aisle was palpable as passengers leaned in to watch, their murmurs trailing Janelle like shadows. In the cramped galley, Linda gestured for Janelle to stand against the side while she spoke into the intercom to contact the ground crew. Janelle stood tall, her face calm but her fingers tapped rhythmically against her bag. "I told you that wallet isn't mine," she said firmly, breaking the silence. "I've been sitting in my seat the entire time." Linda turned back to her, crossing her arms. "We'll let security handle that," she said sharply, her gaze unwavering. At that moment, Emily stepped into the galley, her voice quieter but insistent. "Linda, I really think we should check the footage before this goes any further. The cameras in first class should—" Linda interrupted her again. "There's no need for that. I saw her with the bag. Let security deal with it." Emily's hesitation lingered, her lips pressing into a thin line before she glanced at Janelle apologetically. Janelle caught her look, and for the first time, she sensed an ally. Janelle pulled out her phone again and typed a quick message. Her calm exterior made it easy to miss the precision in her movements. "Linda," she said, looking up, her tone now cooler. "You're making a big mistake. If you'd bothered to verify the situation properly, you'd already know this wallet doesn't belong to me." Linda scoffed, brushing off Janelle's words. But before she could respond, the door to the galley opened, and two security officers stepped in, their presence commanding immediate attention. One of them spoke, his tone neutral but firm. "We received a report about a missing item. Who's involved?" Linda gestured toward Janelle without hesitation. "This passenger," she said. "She was found with the missing wallet in her possession." The officer looked at Janelle, then at Linda. "Has anyone reviewed the camera footage in the cabin?" he asked. Linda stiffened slightly, her confidence faltering for a split second. "I don't believe that's necessary. I witnessed—" The officer raised a hand, cutting her off. "That's standard protocol. We'll handle this." He turned to his partner, who nodded and exited the galley. Linda's face tightened, but she said nothing, stepping back to let the officers proceed. Janelle stayed silent, her expression steady as she watched the unfolding scene. Deep down, she could feel the shift beginning, but she kept her composure. This was far from over. The tension in the galley thickened as one of the officers stepped out to retrieve the security footage. Linda fidgeted slightly, but her confidence hadn't completely wavered. She folded her arms tightly across her chest, her posture stiff, while Janelle stood calmly, her phone still in her hand. "You're awfully calm for someone accused of theft," Linda said, her voice dripping with skepticism. Janelle raised an eyebrow but didn't take the bait. "I'm calm because I have nothing to hide," she replied, her tone steady. "But the longer this goes on, the worse it will be for you." Before Linda could retort, the second officer returned, carrying a small tablet connected to the plane's security feed. He spoke quietly to his partner before looking directly at Linda. "We've reviewed the footage," he began. Linda's stiff posture began to relax slightly, as if she expected vindication. The officer's next words, however, wiped the confidence from her face. The footage shows another passenger removing the wallet and placing it into the overhead bin near this passenger's seat. He glanced at Janelle, his voice neutral as he continued. She didn't touch the wallet at any point. Janelle's expression didn't change, but her sharp eyes flicked toward Linda, watching her reaction carefully. Linda's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The younger flight attendant, Emily, stood frozen, her face a mixture of relief and discomfort. "Are you sure?" Linda asked weakly, her voice no longer carrying the authority it once had. The officer gave her a firm nod. "Absolutely. The footage is clear. The wallet was misplaced, not stolen. And this passenger," he gestured to Janelle, "had nothing to do with it." The air in the galley grew heavier as the weight of the revelation settled over them. Linda's face paled slightly, and her arms dropped to her sides. Janelle, however, stood taller, her calm demeanor unwavering. She didn't gloat, didn't smile. She simply stared at Linda with an expression that said more than words ever could. "I believe that settles it," Janelle said quietly, breaking the silence. "Now, if you're done accusing me of crimes I didn't commit, I'd like to return to my seat." The officers exchanged a glance before one of them nodded. "You're free to go, ma'am," he said politely. "We'll handle the situation from here." Janelle picked up her bag and walked past Linda without another word. Emily stepped aside to let her pass, her eyes wide with something that looked like admiration. As Janelle re-entered the main cabin, the murmurs of the passengers began to fade. She sat down gracefully, placing her bag back in the overhead compartment as if nothing had happened. But for Linda, everything had changed. The officers turned their attention to her, their expressions stern. One of them spoke, his voice low but firm. "We'll need to discuss your conduct. Your actions today have serious implications." Linda swallowed hard, her earlier bravado completely gone. She glanced toward the cabin where Janelle sat, her composed figure now a stark reminder of the consequences of her assumptions. Linda's pulse quickened as the officers gestured for her to follow them toward the front of the plane. For the first time, a flicker of fear crossed her face. Meanwhile, Janelle adjusted her seatbelt and returned her focus to her tablet. She didn't need to look up to know that Linda's fate had already been sealed. The wheels of accountability had been set in motion, and there was no stopping them now. The officers escorted Linda toward the front of the plane, their voices low as they spoke. Her steps were slow, hesitant, and her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and dread. Passengers craned their necks to watch the scene unfold, their whispers growing louder with every passing second. The once authoritative flight attendant now looked smaller, stripped of the confidence she had worn so boldly just minutes ago. In her seat, Janelle remained composed, scrolling through her tablet as though the disruption had never happened. But her mind was far from calm. She was replaying every moment in her head, the accusation, the public humiliation, and now the slow unraveling of Linda's control. Janelle wasn't one to take satisfaction in someone else's downfall, but she couldn't deny the importance of what was happening. This wasn't just about her. It was about the broader issue of being unfairly targeted and treated. The captain emerged from the cockpit, his calm expression shifting slightly as he took in the scene at the front of the plane. He approached the officers, speaking briefly with them before turning to Linda. His tone was polite but firm. "Ms. Harmon, I've been informed of the situation. The ground crew will handle the matter once we land. Until then, I need you to step aside and allow the other crew members to manage the cabin." Linda's eyes widened, but she nodded, her words sticking in her throat. She stepped away, her usual authoritative demeanor completely gone. One of the younger flight attendants hesitated before stepping forward to take over Linda's duties. The passengers whispered among themselves, their curiosity and shock evident in the way they glanced between Linda and Janelle. Meanwhile, Emily approached Janelle quietly, her expression a mix of guilt and admiration. She knelt slightly so she could speak without drawing attention. "I wanted to apologize," she said softly, "for everything. This should never have happened." Janelle looked up, her face neutral but her tone firm. "It's not your fault, Emily. You tried to speak up. That matters." Emily nodded, her relief palpable, and stood to return to her duties. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the tension began to dissipate. Janelle leaned back in her seat, her calm expression masking the fire of determination still burning inside her. She reached for her phone again and typed a message to her assistant. "Situation resolved. Ensure the board receives an update. Also, note Emily Reed's professionalism." She hit send and slipped the phone back into her bag. It wasn't over yet. Not for Linda, not for the airline, and not for anyone who thought they could get away with behavior like this. But for now, Janelle allowed herself to relax, knowing the first steps toward accountability had already been taken. As the flight stabilized into its mid-air routine, the passengers seemed to settle, though the earlier drama lingered in their whispers. In first class, some cast furtive glances toward Janelle, a mix of curiosity and discomfort in their eyes. Others avoided looking altogether, burying themselves in their books or screens. Janelle, however, remained unbothered. She sipped her water and opened her notebook, jotting down thoughts as though the world around her had quieted. At the front of the plane, Linda sat stiffly in a jump seat near the galley, her head lowered and her face flushed with embarrassment. She could feel the weight of the stares from passengers and crew alike. The younger flight attendants avoided her gaze, busying themselves with serving refreshments and managing the cabin. Even Dennis, the senior flight attendant who had worked with Linda for years, seemed to keep his distance, his usual camaraderie absent. The captain reappeared briefly in the galley, speaking quietly with the officers who had taken up positions nearby. Linda strained to hear but could only make out fragments. Words like protocol, complaint, and ground team carried a weight she couldn't ignore. The captain's expression was unreadable, but his clipped tone made it clear that this was no small issue. Back in her seat, Janelle glanced at her watch, calculating how much time remained before landing. Her composed exterior hadn't cracked once during the ordeal, but she wasn't naive. She knew this incident was far from over, and she wasn't about to let it fade quietly into the background. The message she had sent earlier wasn't just an update. It was a signal to her team to start preparing a formal complaint. Janelle understood the power of accountability, and she intended to use it. Nearby, one of the passengers leaned across the aisle, his voice low but filled with curiosity. "That was some scene earlier. Are you okay?" he asked, his tone cautious. Janelle turned to him, her expression calm but firm. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied. Her tone made it clear that she wasn't interested in discussing the matter further. The man nodded, sensing her boundaries, and leaned back into his seat. As the flight attendants moved through the aisles with carts of drinks and snacks, Emily approached Janelle again, this time with a glass of sparkling water and a small tray of snacks. "Compliments of the cabin crew," she said softly, setting them down on Janelle's tray table. Her voice was steady, but the faintest hint of nervousness lingered in her expression. Janelle looked up, offering a polite but restrained smile. "Thank you, Emily," she said simply, her tone warm but measured. Emily nodded and moved on, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she walked away. The minutes ticked by, and the cabin began to settle into a quiet rhythm again. But Janelle could feel the undercurrent of tension, the way passengers and crew seemed hyper-aware of her presence. She wasn't just another passenger anymore. She had become the focal point of an unfolding drama that was far from its conclusion. Linda, meanwhile, sat frozen in her jump seat, replaying the events in her mind. For years, she had prided herself on being a seasoned professional, someone who could command respect with a single glance. But now, her judgment, and the biases she hadn't even acknowledged, had brought her to this moment. She stole a glance toward Janelle, who was now calmly writing in her notebook, completely composed. It was then that Linda felt the sting of regret creeping in. For the first time, she wondered not how this incident would impact her, but how it had impacted Janelle. That thought, however brief, stayed with her as the plane cruised forward, the quiet hum of the engines filling the tense silence. As the flight progressed, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their descent would begin shortly. The routine announcement seemed to ground the cabin, but the earlier tension was still palpable. Janelle looked out the window, watching the scattered clouds blur against the endless blue. She glanced at her watch again, noting how little time remained before the next phase of the situation unfolded. In the galley, Linda was approached by Dennis, his expression more serious than she had ever seen. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, and spoke in a low voice. "Linda, I've heard some things from the officers. This is bigger than you think. You're not just dealing with a frustrated passenger here." Linda didn't meet his gaze. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," she muttered, her voice shaky. "I was just trying to—" "To what?" Dennis interrupted. "You didn't even check the footage before accusing her. Do you realize how this looks? First-class passenger, clear ticket, and you went straight to blame." Linda finally looked up, her expression defensive. "I was following my instincts. She stopped herself, realizing how her words might sound. Dennis shook his head, disappointment flickering across his face. "Instincts? That's what you're going with? This isn't just about you, Linda. The airline's name is on the line, and they'll throw you under the bus to protect it." Linda stiffened, but she couldn't argue. Deep down, she knew Dennis was right. She had overstepped, and now the consequences were unavoidable. Meanwhile, in the main cabin, Janelle put away her notebook and reached for her phone again. Her fingers moved quickly as she typed a short message. "Prepare the statement. Be ready to escalate." She hit send and placed the phone back in her bag. Her calm exterior had returned, but her focus was razor sharp. Emily passed through the aisle one last time before landing, her steps lighter as she distributed mints and checked seatbelts. She paused near Janelle's seat, hesitating before speaking. "Miss Carter," she said softly, leaning in. "Thank you for handling everything with such grace. I don't think I could have done the same." Janelle looked up, her expression softening slightly. "You've done more than most would, Emily. That matters." Emily smiled faintly, her shoulders relaxing. "I just wanted to say, if there's anything else you need, I'll let you know," Janelle said, cutting her off gently but firmly. She appreciated Emily's kindness, but she knew the time for small reassurances had passed. The wheels were already in motion. At the front of the plane, the officers prepared to speak with the ground crew as the flight descended. Linda shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her mind racing. She had never felt so exposed, so uncertain. Every second brought her closer to the inevitable reckoning she could no longer avoid. The plane's engines roared softly as they began their descent, the city below coming into view through the scattered clouds. Janelle leaned back in her seat, her gaze steady, her breathing calm. She knew this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about setting a precedent, ensuring no one else would face what she had endured. As the seatbelt sign illuminated and the passengers prepared for landing, Janelle crossed her arms lightly and allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. She had been through worse in her life, and she knew that what came next was just another step forward. But she also knew this time, she wasn't the one who needed to worry. The plane touched down smoothly, the tires skimming the runway before settling with a soft rumble. As the aircraft slowed, the cabin filled with the familiar shuffling of passengers unbuckling their seatbelts and gathering their belongings. For most, the flight was ending as uneventfully as any other. But for Linda and Janelle, the real confrontation was about to begin. Janelle stayed seated, her movements deliberate, showing no signs of rushing to join the line of passengers eager to disembark. Her calmness was striking, especially compared to the tension radiating from Linda at the front of the plane. Janelle took her phone from her bag again, typing a quick message to her assistant. "We've landed. Monitor the situation as planned." The cabin crew began opening the overhead compartments, assisting passengers with their bags. Emily made her way back to Janelle's row, her nervous energy still evident as she glanced between Janelle and the other flight attendants. She gave Janelle a brief nod, her attempt at reassurance, before moving on. At the front of the plane, Linda stood rigidly near the exit, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She avoided looking at the passengers filing past her, aware of the whispers and sidelong glances she was receiving. The captain emerged briefly, his expression neutral but stern, as he exchanged a few quiet words with the officers. Linda caught snippets of their conversation. Executive team, disciplinary hearing, immediate action. Her stomach churned. Janelle finally rose from her seat, smoothing her blazer and gathering her bag with calm precision. She moved deliberately toward the front of the cabin, her presence commanding attention even without effort. Passengers who had been whispering fell silent as she passed, their curiosity now mixed with respect. When Janelle reached the exit, Linda met her gaze for the first time since the confrontation. There was no defiance left in Linda's eyes, only uncertainty and a flicker of something that resembled regret. Janelle paused, her expression unreadable, and spoke in a tone just loud enough for Linda to hear. "I told you this was a mistake," she said, her words measured and sharp. "Now it's out of your hands." Before Linda could respond, Janelle stepped past her, greeting the captain and the officers with a calm nod as she exited the plane. The officers turned to Linda, their expressions grim. One of them motioned for her to follow. "Miss Harmon, we'll need to have a word with you before you leave," he said firmly. Linda's face paled, and she hesitated before stepping forward, her head lowered as she walked. Passengers still lingering in the aisle murmured, some clearly piecing together what was happening. The once commanding figure of Linda Harmon had been reduced to someone scrambling to contain the consequences of her actions. Outside, Janelle entered the jet bridge, where a representative from the airline's corporate team stood waiting. The representative, a polished woman in a sharp suit, greeted her with a respectful nod. "Miss Carter, we're terribly sorry for the events that transpired during your flight," she began, her tone practiced but sincere. "The matter is being handled, and we've initiated a formal review." Janelle raised a hand, stopping the woman mid-sentence. "We'll talk," she said simply, "after I've reviewed the initial report. Right now, I have somewhere to be." The woman nodded quickly, stepping aside as Janelle walked toward the terminal with steady, purposeful strides. The wheels of accountability had turned in her favor, but she knew this was only the beginning. Behind her, the situation continued to unravel, and Janelle didn't need to look back to know that justice, in its quiet and deliberate way, was already in motion. Janelle stepped into the bustling terminal, the noise of travelers and flight announcements filling the air. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder, her movements composed and deliberate. As she made her way to the baggage claim, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out to find a message from her assistant. "Spoke with the airline's executive team. They're aware. A formal apology is being drafted. Legal options are ready if needed." Janelle read the message with a slight nod, then typed a brief response. "Good. Keep me updated. Ensure they prioritize changes, not just words." She slipped the phone back into her pocket, her expression neutral, but her mind was already considering the next steps. This wasn't about a personal apology. It was about addressing the systemic failure that allowed someone like Linda to feel justified in targeting her. Back at the gate, Linda sat stiffly in a small room near the jet bridge. The officers had escorted her there after passengers disembarked, and now she was facing a member of the ground operations team who was taking notes on her account. Linda's hands trembled slightly as she recounted the events, carefully choosing her words to downplay her actions. "I thought it was a simple mistake," she said, her voice strained. "I didn't realize how it would escalate." The man listening to her frowned, his pen pausing mid-note. "You didn't follow protocol," he said plainly. "Reviewing footage is a basic step. Instead, you escalated the situation without evidence." Linda opened her mouth to respond, but hesitated. Deep down, she knew he was right. She had acted impulsively, driven by assumptions she didn't want to admit, even to herself. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, and for the first time, she realized how unprepared she was for what came next. Meanwhile, Janelle arrived at the baggage claim, her eyes scanning the carousel as it began to rotate. She spotted her sleek black suitcase quickly, lifting it with ease and wheeling it toward the exit. Several passengers from her flight lingered nearby, their glances filled with a mix of curiosity and respect. Some seemed tempted to approach her, but the composed way she carried herself made it clear she wasn't interested in idle conversation. Just as Janelle exited the terminal, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call. She glanced at the screen before answering. "Janelle Carter," she said, her tone calm and professional. The voice on the other end belonged to a senior member of the airline's executive team. "Miss Carter, thank you for taking my call," the man began, his voice carefully measured. "We're deeply sorry for the experience you endured on today's flight. Please know that we are conducting a thorough investigation and will be implementing immediate measures to address this." Janelle listened without interrupting, her silence prompting the man to continue. "We've already removed the flight attendant from active duty pending review. Additionally, we'd like to offer you compensation for the inconvenience." Janelle's voice was steady as she replied, "This isn't about compensation. It's about accountability. Your employee acted inappropriately and your system allowed it. I want to know what changes you're making to ensure this doesn't happen again." The executive paused, clearly thrown by her directness. "We are already discussing mandatory training programs and policy revisions," he said. "We'll provide you with a detailed timeline." "Good," Janelle said. "Send it to my office and let me be clear, this isn't just about me. This is about ensuring no one else is subjected to the same treatment." The executive stammered slightly but quickly assured her that they were taking the matter seriously. Janelle ended the call with a curt but polite goodbye, her resolve stronger than ever. Outside the terminal, her car pulled up, a sleek black sedan with her driver, William, stepping out to greet her. "Miss Carter," he said with a slight bow, opening the door for her. "I trust your trip was eventful." Janelle gave him a faint smile as she slid into the back seat. "More than I expected, William," she said, her voice calm. "Let's head to the office. There's work to do." As the car pulled away, the terminal faded into the distance, but the events of the day remained fresh in Janelle's mind. She didn't just want an apology, she wanted action, change, and a system that held people accountable for their actions. And she knew she was just the person to make it happen. Linda sat alone in the stark, windowless room near the jet bridge, her uniform feeling tighter, heavier than it ever had before. The officer who had escorted her earlier had left, and she was now waiting for a representative from the airline's Human Resources Department to arrive. Every second dragged like an eternity. Her mind replayed the events on a loop, each detail sharper and more damning with every pass. The humiliation of being called out in front of passengers, the firm rebuke from the officers, and the realization that she had acted on little more than a gut feeling, all of it weighed on her heavily. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. A woman in a gray suit stepped in, her expression professional but detached. She carried a tablet in one hand and a slim folder in the other. Without introducing herself, the woman took a seat across from Linda and began tapping on her tablet. "Ms. Harmon," the woman began, her tone clipped. "I'm here on behalf of the airline to document your account of the incident. I trust you're aware of the seriousness of the situation." Linda nodded stiffly, her throat dry. "I didn't mean for it to get out of hand," she started, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought I was acting in the best interest of the passengers." The woman raised an eyebrow, her fingers pausing mid-type. "Best interest? From the report I've received, you accused a first-class passenger of theft without evidence, failed to review available security footage, and escalated the situation unnecessarily. Do you dispute any of that?" Linda's heart sank further. I didn't have time to check the footage," she said weakly. You thought wrong," the woman interrupted sharply. "We're in the business of facts, not assumptions, Ms. Harmon. And your assumptions have not only embarrassed the airline but also exposed us to potential legal action." Linda swallowed hard. "Legal action?" she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's gaze didn't soften. "Miss Carter has connections to the airline's board and a professional reputation that far outweighs whatever authority you thought you had in that moment. If she chooses to pursue legal recourse, this could go far beyond a disciplinary hearing. Linda's hands tightened into fists on her lap. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she had acted out of instinct, but every excuse she thought of sounded hollow even to her own ears. She had made a mistake, one that could end her career. The woman continued, flipping open the folder she'd brought. "You're being placed on immediate suspension pending a formal review. You'll receive written notice of the outcome, but I would recommend preparing for the possibility of termination. Additionally, the airline will expect your full cooperation should Miss Carter or her legal team require further details." Linda nodded numbly. She couldn't speak, the words catching in her throat. The woman didn't wait for a response. She gathered her things, rose from her chair, and left the room without so much as a glance back. Meanwhile, outside the terminal, Janelle's car weaved through city traffic toward her downtown office. Inside the sleek black sedan, she was reviewing an email from her assistant that contained a draft of the airline's official apology. It was polished, full of corporate speak about regrettable incidents and commitment to diversity, but Janelle wasn't impressed. She typed a reply with quick, deliberate keystrokes. "Rewrite this to address specific actions. Vague promises don't mean anything without measurable steps. Include details about the new training programs and deadlines for implementation." Hitting send, Janelle leaned back in her seat and exhaled deeply. The day had been exhausting, but her mind was already moving ahead. She didn't have time to dwell on the personal slight. Her focus was on the bigger picture. The airline's response needed to go beyond damage control. It had to set a precedent. By the time her car pulled into the underground parking lot of her office building, Janelle had already shifted into work mode. Her assistant, Maya, greeted her at the elevator with a tablet in hand. "I've updated the report with additional notes from the legal team," Maya said as they walked together toward Janelle's office. "The airline's board is requesting a meeting tomorrow to discuss their action plan." "Good," Janelle replied, her tone sharp but calm. "And make sure they know I'll be asking for specifics. I'm not interested in empty gestures." As they entered her corner office, the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the city skyline. Janelle set her bag down and scanned the updated report Maya had prepared. It detailed the airline's initial steps to address the incident. Mandatory sensitivity training for all flight attendants, a review of disciplinary procedures, and the creation of a passenger advocate position to handle complaints more effectively. "It's a start," Janelle said, handing the tablet back to Maya. "But it's not enough. They need to acknowledge that incidents like this don't happen in isolation. They're part of a larger problem." Maya nodded, jotting down notes. "I'll make sure that's included in tomorrow's discussion." As the sun began to set, casting golden light across her office, Janelle sat at her desk, staring out at the city. The events of the day replayed in her mind, but she didn't feel anger anymore. Instead, she felt a quiet determination. What had started as a personal affront was now an opportunity to create lasting change, and Janelle was ready to see it through. Back at the airport, Linda sat slumped in her car in the employee parking lot, her termination seeming more certain with each passing minute. Her phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, some offering sympathy, others avoiding direct mention of the incident. She stared at the screen, knowing she had no one to blame but herself. For the first time, she realized just how much damage a single moment of bias could cause, not just to someone else's dignity, but to her own career and reputation. As the night fell, two women sat in very different places, each reflecting on the same event. For Janelle, it was a step toward accountability. For Linda, it was the beginning of a harsh reckoning. But one thing was certain: neither would ever forget what had transpired aboard that flight. Linda's car felt like a prison. She hadn't started the engine yet, her hands resting limply on the steering wheel. Her phone vibrated on the seat next to her, displaying another message from a colleague. "What happened? I heard you got pulled from the flight. Are you okay?" She didn't answer. How could she? The walls of her professional world were collapsing around her, and it was her own actions that had knocked them down. The realization was almost suffocating. She had built a career on being strict but efficient, a stickler for rules, someone her peers respected and even admired. But all it had taken was one poor judgment, one reckless assumption, to bring everything to the edge of ruin. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on her car window. She jumped, startled, and turned to see Dennis standing outside, his face as stern as it had been during their brief exchange earlier. Reluctantly, she rolled down the window. "Mind if I sit?" Dennis asked, his voice neutral but edged with disappointment. Linda sighed and unlocked the passenger door. Dennis slid into the seat, closing the door quietly behind him. He sat silently for a moment, his gaze fixed on the dashboard. Finally, he spoke. "I've known you a long time, Linda," he began, his voice steady. "You've always been sharp, capable. But today you crossed a line I didn't think you ever would." Linda flinched at his words, but she didn't respond. What could she say? He was right. Dennis leaned back, his arms crossed. "Do you even understand what happened back there? What you did? That woman wasn't just some random passenger. She paid for her seat. She followed every rule, and yet you treated her like she didn't belong." "I thought," Linda started, but Dennis cut her off. "You thought she didn't belong. That's the problem," he said sharply. "You didn't ask questions. You didn't follow protocol. You made a decision based on nothing but your assumptions. And now look where that's gotten you." Linda's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly, unwilling to break down in front of Dennis. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to." She struggled to find the right words, but none came. Dennis sighed heavily. "Intent doesn't matter, Linda. Impact does. That woman, Miss Carter, she didn't just experience a bad flight. She was humiliated in front of a cabin full of people. And for what? Because you didn't take 5 minutes to check the footage?" Linda's jaw tightened. She knew he was right, but hearing it out loud was unbearable. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles whitening. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dennis shook his head slowly. "That's not up to me. The airline will handle it, and from what I've heard, it's not going to be pretty. Miss Carter isn't just another passenger. She's got connections, big ones. But honestly, even if she didn't, you'd still be in hot water. The world's different now, Linda. People won't stand for this kind of thing anymore." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Linda stared straight ahead, her mind a storm of regret and fear. She thought back to the way Janelle had looked at her, calm, composed, and completely unshaken, even as Linda had tried to strip her of her dignity. That image burned in her mind, a constant reminder of her failure. Meanwhile, miles away, Janelle sat in her office, her team gathered around the conference table as they reviewed the latest updates. Maya handed her a printed report, her expression both professional and sympathetic. "The airline has issued their first public statement," Maya said. "It's standard, apologizing for the incident, reaffirming their commitment to customer satisfaction, that sort of thing." Janelle scanned the document, her sharp eyes picking apart the language. "This is vague," she said bluntly. "They're apologizing without addressing the root of the problem. Where's the acknowledgement of bias? The steps they're taking to prevent this from happening again?" Maya hesitated. "They've mentioned sensitivity training and policy reviews, but there's no timeline attached. It feels more like damage control than real change." Janelle set the report down, her jaw tightening. "Then we need to push harder, draft a response, make it clear that I'm not interested in empty promises. I want specifics, deadlines, measurable goals, and accountability. If they're serious about fixing this, they'll listen." The team nodded, quickly scribbling notes as Janelle leaned back in her chair. She knew how this game was played. Companies like the airline often made surface-level gestures to pacify public outrage, but she wasn't going to let that happen here. This wasn't just about her. It was about every passenger who had ever been treated unfairly because someone in power had decided they didn't belong. As the meeting continued, Janelle's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen. A call from one of the airline's board members. She raised a hand to pause the discussion and answered the call. "Miss Carter, thank you for taking the time," the board member began, their tone carefully polite. "I want to personally apologize on behalf of the airline. We've been reviewing the incident thoroughly, and I assure you, we're committed to making this right." Janelle's voice was calm but firm. "I appreciate the apology," she said, "but words aren't enough. What specific actions are you taking to ensure this doesn't happen again?" The board member hesitated, caught off guard by her directness. "We're finalizing our plans now," they said. "There will be mandatory training programs for all staff, a comprehensive review of our policies, and an internal audit to identify any systemic issues." "And when will these measures be implemented?" Janelle pressed. "Because vague promises won't cut it. I expect clear deadlines and regular updates. This isn't just about me. It's about ensuring your staff is equipped to treat every passenger with respect." The board member stammered slightly, but quickly recovered. "Of course, Miss Carter. We'll provide you with a detailed timeline within the next 48 hours. And if you have any additional recommendations, we'd be happy to include them." "I'll be in touch," Janelle said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She ended the call and turned back to her team, her resolve stronger than ever. Across the city, Linda sat in her car long after Dennis had left, her thoughts swirling. She didn't know what her future held, but for the first time she began to realize that she couldn't just move past this. She had to confront it, and maybe, just maybe, she could learn from it. But that road was long and uncertain, and for now, all she could do was sit and wait for the consequences she knew were coming. The airline's corporate offices were bustling the following morning, but the tension was thicker than usual. Executives shuffled between meeting rooms, carrying folders and tablets, their faces drawn tight with worry. The incident involving Janelle Carter had already reached the media, sparking a wave of criticism that the company wasn't prepared for. News outlets had begun running headlines like, "Airline under fire for bias after passenger accused without evidence," and social media was ablaze with passengers sharing their own stories of mistreatment. It was clear the airline had a crisis on its hands. In a sleek, glass-walled boardroom, Janelle sat at the head of a large table, her posture confident and her expression unyielding. Across from her sat three of the airline's senior executives, including Richard Hale, the CEO. They had invited Janelle to a meeting to discuss the incident, but the atmosphere made it clear that this wasn't just a polite conversation, it was damage control. Richard cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. "Miss Carter, first and foremost, I want to extend my deepest apologies for what occurred on your flight. What you experienced was unacceptable, and it does not reflect the values of our airline." Janelle didn't react immediately. She let his words settle in the room, her silence forcing him to shift uncomfortably in his seat. Then she leaned forward slightly, her hands folded neatly on the table. "Apologies are a start," she said calmly, "but they're meaningless without action. What happened on that flight wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a broader problem, one that goes beyond your airline." Richard nodded, his expression grave. "You're absolutely right. That's why we've already begun implementing changes. Sensitivity training for all employees, a review of our hiring and onboarding practices, and stricter protocols for handling passenger disputes. We want to ensure that something like this never happens again." Janelle raised an eyebrow. "Those are all good steps, but I've reviewed your public statement, and it's vague at best. What's the timeline for these changes? Who's overseeing them? And how will you measure success?" Richard glanced at the executive sitting beside him, a woman in charge of operations, who quickly pulled up a document on her tablet. "We've set a preliminary timeline of 3 months to roll out the first phase of training," she said. "We'll begin with flight crews and expand to ground staff and corporate employees. An external consultant specializing in bias and diversity training will be leading the initiative." Janelle nodded slightly, but her gaze didn't soften. "And accountability? What measures are being taken to ensure this isn't just a one-time response to bad publicity?" The operations executive hesitated, but Richard spoke up. We're establishing an internal oversight committee to monitor progress and report directly to the board. Additionally, we'll be creating a passenger advocacy role to address complaints more effectively. We'd also welcome your input, Miss Carter, on how we can improve. Janelle's expression remained neutral as she considered his words. I'll provide feedback, she said, her tone cool but firm. But let me be clear, this isn't just about fixing your airline's image. This is about addressing a systemic issue. If I don't see real, measurable progress, I won't hesitate to hold you accountable, publicly. The executives exchanged uneasy glances. They knew she meant it. The power dynamic in the room was undeniable. Janelle wasn't just a wronged passenger. She was a force they couldn't afford to ignore. As the meeting continued, Janelle laid out her expectations in meticulous detail. She requested regular updates on the progress of their initiatives, a breakdown of how the training programs would be evaluated, and a clear plan for addressing complaints like hers in the future. The executives took copious notes, nodding along but clearly aware that they were being held to a higher standard than they'd anticipated. By the time the meeting ended, the tone in the room had shifted. Richard extended his hand to Janelle, his voice sincere but cautious. Thank you for your time, Miss Carter. We'll make this right. Janelle shook his hand briefly, her grip firm. I'll hold you to that, she said before turning to leave. Back at her office, Janelle wasted no time. Maya was waiting for her with updates from the media and reports on how the incident was being discussed online. The story's gone viral, Maya said, handing Janelle a printed sheet with trending hashtags. Most of the responses are supportive, but there's some backlash. People questioning if this is being blown out of proportion. Janelle scanned the page, her eyes narrowing. Of course there is, she said. That's how these things go. But this isn't about a single incident. It's about setting a precedent. If we let this slide, it sends a message that this kind of behavior is acceptable. It's not. Maya nodded, scribbling notes as Janelle continued. Draft a statement for me to post. Something concise but firm. I want to remind people that this is about accountability, not vengeance. On it, Maya said, quickly typing on her tablet. Meanwhile, Linda sat in her small apartment staring at her laptop. The email she had received earlier that day confirmed what she already knew. She was officially terminated from her position. The words on the screen blurred as tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to cry. Not yet. Instead, she began typing. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment before she started her message. An email addressed to the airline's board and to Janelle Carter herself. She didn't know if it would make a difference, but she felt compelled to say something. Miss Carter, she wrote, I owe you an apology. What I did on that flight was wrong, and I take full responsibility for my actions. I let my assumptions guide me instead of following the facts, and for that, I am deeply sorry. I understand now how my actions reflected not only my personal biases, but also a system that allowed them to go unchecked. I'm committed to educating myself and doing better wherever I go from here. I hope my mistake can serve as a lesson for others. She hit send before she could second-guess herself, then closed her laptop and stared at the blank wall in front of her. For the first time since the incident, she felt a glimmer of clarity. It wasn't redemption, but it was a step. Janelle received the email later that evening. She read it carefully, her expression unreadable. She didn't respond immediately, instead forwarding it to Maya with a note. File this with the rest of the documents. It's a start, but it doesn't change what needs to happen. As the day came to a close, two very different women reflected on the events that had brought them here. Janelle, with a quiet determination to keep pushing for systemic change, and Linda, grappling with the weight of her mistakes and the long road ahead. Both knew that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something larger than themselves. Linda sat on her small couch, her apartment dimly lit by the glow of a single lamp. She stared at the empty coffee mug in her hands, the remnants of lukewarm liquid swirling at the bottom. The email she had sent earlier hung in her mind, an admission she had never imagined herself writing. She wasn't sure if Janelle would respond, or if she even deserved one. Her termination notice sat printed on the table next to her. It detailed her failure to follow protocol, the complaints filed against her, and the airline's decision to part ways with her. Each line felt like a nail in the coffin of a career she had spent years building. But no matter how much she wanted to argue against it, Linda couldn't escape the truth. This was her fault. She pulled out her laptop again and began searching for resources on unconscious bias training. She didn't know where to start, or even how to begin untangling the assumptions that had led to her actions. But she had to try. Her mistakes had cost her more than just her job. They had forced her to confront parts of herself she had ignored for too long. Meanwhile, across the city, Janelle was in her office, finalizing a statement with her assistant Maya. The statement was direct and purposeful, balancing her personal experience with a call to action for broader accountability. Maya read it back aloud as Janelle paced the room, her hands clasped behind her back. My experience on Flight 728 was not just about a single act of bias. It was a reflection of systemic issues that extend far beyond one airline. While I appreciate the steps being taken by the airline to address this, I will continue to push for meaningful, measurable changes, not just for myself, but for every passenger who deserves to be treated with respect. This is not about one person or one mistake. It's about creating a system that values fairness, accountability, and dignity above all else. Maya glanced up. It's strong. Director, do you want to add anything about the termination of the flight attendant? Janelle shook her head. This isn't about her as an individual. The issue is bigger than that. Her actions were a symptom of the system, not the cause. Maya nodded, quickly typing the final edits before preparing to post the statement to Janelle's social media accounts. As Janelle sat down at her desk, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The whirlwind of events over the past few days had been draining, but it had also reinforced her purpose. She wasn't here to punish individuals. She was here to demand accountability from institutions. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a notification from a news outlet reporting that the airline had released an updated statement. Janelle clicked the link, her eyes scanning the screen. The statement was longer and more detailed than their initial apology. It outlined the airline's new training initiatives, including a mandatory program on unconscious bias for all employees and regular audits to ensure compliance with passenger rights. The statement also confirmed the creation of a passenger advocacy team, something Janelle had explicitly recommended during her meeting with the executives. Janelle felt a flicker of satisfaction. It wasn't everything she had pushed for, but it was a start. She forwarded the statement to Maya, adding a note. Make sure our team tracks their progress on these commitments. If they don't follow through, we'll hold them accountable. Across the office, Maya grinned. You really are relentless, aren't you? She said, half joking. Janelle looked at her, her expression softening slightly. Relentless is the only way things change, Maya. You have to hold the line, or they'll slip back into their old habits the moment the spotlight fades. As the team wrapped up for the evening, Janelle received another email, this one from the airline's CEO, Richard Hale. The tone was more personal than their earlier exchanges, and it included a request for Janelle to serve as an external advisor on their new diversity and inclusion initiatives. Janelle raised an eyebrow at the offer, but didn't respond immediately. She wanted to see more concrete action before aligning herself too closely with the company. Back in her apartment, Linda scrolled through her phone, watching as news of her termination spread online. Her name wasn't mentioned explicitly, but she knew enough about how the internet worked to realize it wouldn't take long for people to connect the dots. She turned off the screen, her stomach churning at the thought of becoming the next viral scandal. Her gaze drifted to a small framed photo on the shelf, her first day as a flight attendant, standing in front of a plane with a wide smile. It felt like a lifetime ago. She had taken so much pride in her job back then, so much joy in the idea of being a trusted professional. Now, that version of herself felt like a stranger. Her phone buzzed again, this time with an email notification. She hesitated before opening it, her heart pounding as she read the subject line. Response to your apology, Janelle Carter. The message was brief but firm. Accountability is the first step. I hope you take this as an opportunity to grow and reflect. While an apology cannot undo what happened, your willingness to take responsibility is a small step in the right direction. I encourage you to use this experience to advocate for change wherever your path takes you. Linda stared at the words, her emotions a mix of shame, gratitude, and a faint glimmer of hope. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was something, a chance perhaps to move forward. At the same time, Janelle stood in her office, gazing out at the city skyline. The events of the past days had left her exhausted but resolute. The fight for accountability wasn't over, not for the airline, not for the industry, and certainly not for the countless others who had faced similar injustices. But for the first time, Janelle allowed herself to believe that real change was possible. She would keep pushing, keep demanding better, and she wouldn't stop until the system was forced to do the same. The next morning, Janelle arrived at the conference center for a panel discussion she had committed to weeks earlier. The event, focused on leadership and equity in business, now felt more relevant than ever. She was scheduled as the keynote speaker, but the organizers had quietly asked if she would address the airline incident during her talk. Walking through the polished halls of the center, Janelle kept her composure as she noted the curious glances from attendees. Word had spread about what had happened, and people were eager to hear her perspective. As she waited backstage, Maya approached with her notes and a final update. The airline has released another statement this morning, Maya said, holding up her tablet. They're committing to quarterly reports on their progress with the new programs. It looks like they're feeling the pressure. Janelle skimmed the statement quickly, nodding. That's a step, but we'll see if they actually deliver. Maya hesitated before speaking again. There's one more thing. Linda Harmon gave an interview to a local outlet. She admitted her actions were wrong and spoke about her decision to pursue training on bias and discrimination. She said she wants to use her experience to help others learn. Janelle raised an eyebrow. Did she? That's unexpected. She mentioned your name, Maya added. Said you handled the situation with grace, and that it made her rethink everything. Janelle let out a soft sigh, her gaze drifting. It's not about me, Maya. It never was. If she's serious about changing, that's her journey. But it doesn't erase what happened. Maya nodded, understanding. You're right. Just thought you'd want to know. A few moments later, the event organizers signaled that it was time. Janelle stepped onto the stage, greeted by a round of applause. The spotlight hit her as she walked to the podium, her sharp blazer catching the light. She took a moment to look out at the packed auditorium before beginning. Good morning, she said, her voice steady and commanding. Today, we're here to talk about leadership and equity, two principles that should be inseparable. Leadership without equity is hollow. It's performative at best, harmful at worst. Her words hung in the air as the audience leaned in, fully engaged. Recently, I had an experience that reminded me why this work is so important, she continued. As some of you may have read, I was wrongfully accused during a flight, a moment that was humiliating, infuriating, and sadly, not unique. What stood out to me wasn't just the personal slight, but the systemic issue it revealed. Bias, whether conscious or unconscious, doesn't just hurt individuals. It undermines organizations, communities, and industries. The room was silent, every word resonating with the audience. Janelle paused briefly, then went on. The airline involved has taken steps to address what happened. That's a start. But what's more important is what happens next. Not just for them, but for all of us. Accountability isn't a one-time event. It's a practice. It's a commitment to learning, growing, and being better every single day. She scanned the audience, her gaze sharp but empathetic. Leadership means making uncomfortable choices. It means admitting when you're wrong and being willing to change. It means listening to those you've ignored, respecting those you've dismissed, and advocating for those who've been silenced. As she spoke, she thought of Linda, not as an enemy, but as a part of the system that needed to change. She thought of Emily, the young flight attendant who had tried to do the right thing, and of the countless passengers who didn't have the platform or resources to demand accountability. She was speaking for all of them. "I want to leave you with this," Janelle said, her voice softening but carrying the same strength. "True equity requires courage, it requires persistence, and it requires each of us to hold ourselves and each other to higher standards. That's not easy, but it's necessary." The audience erupted into applause as Janelle stepped back from the podium, a wave of gratitude and admiration washing over the room. As she exited the stage, Maya was waiting for her, a proud smile on her face. "You nailed it," Maya said. "I think that's going to stick with a lot of people." Janelle gave her a small smile. "Let's hope so. But this is just one speech. The real work is still ahead." Across town, Linda sat in the back row of a small training seminar on unconscious bias. She had signed up for the program on her own, unsure of what to expect but determined to start somewhere. The room was filled with people from various industries, all grappling with their own questions about how bias shaped their decisions. As the facilitator began the session, Linda took a deep breath and opened her notebook. She wasn't sure where this journey would take her, but for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of purpose. She knew she had a long way to go, but she was willing to do the work. That evening, Janelle returned to her apartment, exhausted but satisfied. She poured herself a glass of water and stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. Her phone buzzed with messages of support, but she set it aside. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply breathe, reflecting on how far she had come, not just in the past few days, but in her life. The work ahead would be hard, but Janelle had never been one to back down from a challenge. She was ready, and she knew she wasn't alone. Change was possible, not just for the airline or for Linda, but for everyone willing to take the first step. As she turned off the lights and prepared for bed, one thought stayed with her. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something bigger, and that was a future worth fighting for. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.